The flight was busy that afternoon, the hum of voices filling the cabin as passengers settled into their seats. The low murmur of chatter, the rustle of newspapers, and the occasional laugh seemed to create a rhythm, almost like a song of a routine journey. The plane was heading toward its destination, a few hours from the bustling city that had just started to fade beneath them. Yet, the peaceful air inside was about to shift. A woman stepped into the cabin, her military uniform standing out in sharp contrast to the business suits and casual clothes around her. She walked with purpose, the weight of her backpack slung over one shoulder, her boots clicking lightly on the floor. The first thing that caught the eye was the way she carried herself, tired but unwavering. The other passengers took quick glances at her, some with curiosity, others with quiet respect. She was a soldier, clearly, her posture telling a story of discipline and strength. She reached the front of the plane where the first-class section began, her gaze briefly flicking over the seats. There were still a few empty ones, though not many. The flight was nearly full. As she moved closer to the luxurious seats, her path was suddenly blocked by a man who had been sitting by the window. He had watched her from the moment she stepped onto the plane. There was something in the way she moved that made him uneasy, something he couldn't quite explain. Perhaps it was the confidence she exuded, or perhaps it was the sight of someone in a uniform, someone who had undoubtedly seen more hardship than he ever would. He stood up abruptly, not giving her much space to maneuver. "I'm sorry," he said with a voice that sounded more dismissive than apologetic, "but there's no space in this section. These seats are reserved for paying customers." His words hung in the air, harsh and cold, and despite the polite tone, there was an unmistakable edge to his voice. It was as if he had made a quick judgment and didn't want her to be anywhere near his comfortable first-class seat. The woman paused for a moment, taken aback by the sudden confrontation. The silence stretched between them as passengers began to notice what was happening. A few whispered to each other, but most remained still, not daring to interfere. The man looked over at the flight attendants, but they had not yet noticed the interaction. The soldier, without skipping a beat, took a step back. "Excuse me," she said calmly, her voice steady. "I'm just trying to get to my seat." Her words were polite, almost too polite. She didn't raise her voice, didn't react with anger. She wasn't in a hurry. She simply turned her gaze toward the back of the plane, where the economy section was located. The man, not satisfied with her composure, scoffed. "You belong back there," he said, jerking his thumb toward the narrow rows behind him. "These seats are for people who've paid for them. Maybe you should try your luck in economy." She didn't flinch. In fact, there was a calmness in her expression that seemed to throw him off. She was not rattled by his words. The soldier gave a nod, almost as if to acknowledge the absurdity of his suggestion, but without engaging in a full confrontation. She turned on her heel and walked down the narrow aisle, passing through the rows of crowded seats. Her steps were measured, her back straight, even though her body language suggested exhaustion. She had no intention of causing a scene. Meanwhile, the man watched her retreat to the back of the plane. He smirked, satisfied with himself. He leaned back in his seat, his legs stretching out in front of him, completely unbothered. His victory over this stranger, this soldier, was complete in his mind. He could still feel the eyes of other passengers on him, but he was used to being the center of attention. His seat in first class was a privilege that he believed he deserved. After all, he had worked hard to get where he was. The soldier, however, did not seem to care about the social hierarchy of the plane. As she walked to the back, she found an empty seat in economy. It was smaller, less comfortable, but it was good enough. The man was oblivious to her dignity, choosing to ignore the fact that she was someone who had likely faced far more difficult situations than any of them could understand. She didn't need special treatment, but it was the ease with which she accepted the situation that left a lasting impact on those around her. No drama, no outburst, just a quiet decision to move on. As the plane continued its journey, the man settled into his first-class seat with an air of superiority. He glanced back at the soldier once more, noticing that she was far from making a fuss. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about her. But he dismissed it, pushing the thought away. He had what he wanted, and the rest of the plane seemed content with the arrangement. What neither the man nor anyone else on the plane knew was that this brief interaction would not end here. The story of the soldier's quiet resilience was far from over. Though the man thought his actions had gone unnoticed, he was about to receive a lesson that would leave him thinking long after the flight had ended. The flight continued on its steady course, the hum of the engines becoming a soothing backdrop to the unfolding events. In first class, the man continued to settle into his seat, enjoying the space around him. He stretched his legs out, glanced at the screen on the back of the seat in front of him, and then picked up a magazine, flipping through the pages without much interest. Despite the small stir his actions had caused, he quickly put it out of his mind. After all, the soldier had taken her place in economy, and he assumed that was the end of it. What he didn't realize was that the encounter wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The soldier, now settled into the cramped seat in the economy section, leaned back slightly, trying to get comfortable for the long flight ahead. She adjusted her bag underneath her seat and looked out the window. The landscape below was nothing more than a blur of clouds, but for her, the view represented a world far away, a world of service, of hard work, of sacrifices. Her mind wandered to the many places she had been, the many things she had seen, but it was clear that she had long ago learned to deal with discomfort. She had been through worse. This small challenge was nothing compared to what she had faced before. She glanced around the cabin. There were families sitting together, some quietly reading, others laughing softly. The hum of conversations filled the air, and there was a sense of normalcy, of people going about their business. The soldier could feel the weight of their eyes on her, but she didn't let it bother her. She had learned long ago to ignore the looks, the judgments, the whispers. The world often misunderstood her, as it misunderstood many others like her. But today, she wasn't bothered by it. As the hours passed, the soldier found herself starting to relax, even if just a little. She wasn't angry. She wasn't upset. She was simply tired, both mentally and physically, from a long day of travel. There was a calmness to her now, a sense of peace that only came with time and experience. But she knew that sometimes, things weren't always as simple as they seemed. She wasn't expecting anything from the man who had made her uncomfortable, but she also knew that sometimes people needed a reminder of who they were, of what truly mattered. Meanwhile, the man in first class had not forgotten about the soldier. Despite his earlier dismissal of her, something was beginning to gnaw at him. He kept thinking about the way she had calmly walked away, about how she hadn't said a word in anger. It was unsettling, in a way. She hadn't argued. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't tried to make a scene, even though he knew he had treated her unfairly. In some strange way, her response made him feel uneasy. It made him wonder if he had done the right thing. He shifted in his seat, trying to focus on his magazine again, but the thought of the soldier and her quiet composure kept returning to his mind. What had happened back there? Why hadn't she fought back? Why hadn't she said anything? It wasn't like him to feel uncertain about his actions. He had always prided himself on his confidence, his ability to make quick decisions. But now he found himself second-guessing those decisions. As the flight continued, the man's unease grew. He glanced over at the flight attendants, who were busy helping other passengers. They didn't seem to notice him, and he didn't want to draw attention to himself. But his mind kept drifting back to the soldier. He wanted to apologize, but something held him back. Perhaps it was his pride, or perhaps it was the realization that apologizing now wouldn't undo what had already been done. Then suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by the sight of the soldier standing up again. She had walked toward the front of the plane, and her presence caught his attention. She didn't look at him as she passed, nor did she acknowledge his gaze. She walked with the same quiet confidence, her head held high, her posture straight. She looked like someone who had made peace with the world, no matter how hard or unfair it might be. She walked calmly to the front, where the flight attendants were standing. The man watched her carefully, trying to make sense of what was happening. The soldier reached one of the attendants, who greeted her with a warm smile. She spoke softly to the attendant, and for a moment, the two exchanged a few words. The man couldn't hear their conversation, but he watched closely. After a brief exchange, the soldier turned away from the attendant and walked back toward her seat in economy. She seemed no different than before, calm, composed, but something about her presence seemed to have shifted the energy around her. The man sat up straighter, suddenly feeling a little uneasy. He had assumed that the soldier had simply accepted her place in economy and was moving on. But now, something felt different. He couldn't quite explain it, but he had the distinct feeling that something was about to happen. He couldn't shake the sense that the soldier wasn't someone who could just be brushed aside, that there was more to her than met the eye. His curiosity piqued. The man turned his attention back to his magazine, but it was clear that his mind was no longer focused on the reading material. He couldn't help but wonder what the soldier had been up to, why she had returned to the front of the plane. What had she said to the attendant? Was there more to her story than he had assumed? He didn't know, but one thing was certain. This was not going to be a simple flight. The hours on the plane slowly passed, but for the man, the sense of unease never quite left. He tried to focus on his surroundings, attempting to distract himself by looking out the window, watching as the clouds rolled by beneath them. But his mind kept returning to the soldier. There was something about her quiet composure that had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He thought about the interaction from earlier, how he had dismissed her without a second thought. At the time, it had seemed like a simple matter, just a matter of seating, of paying for the privilege to sit in first class. But now, looking back, the man couldn't help but feel that there was more to it than he had realized. As he sat in his seat, trying to push the thoughts away, the plane continued to hum along at cruising altitude. The people around him were settling into their own routines, flipping through magazines, chatting with their seatmates, or simply resting with their eyes closed. The flight attendants moved up and down the aisles, offering drinks and snacks, and the atmosphere was calm, even serene. But for the man, the serenity was broken by the nagging thoughts of what had happened earlier. He had expected the soldier to argue, to raise her voice and demand her place in first class. That's what he had been prepared for. But instead, she had walked away without a word of protest, without any sign of anger. That had thrown him off balance. She hadn't fought back, and that was what made him feel uneasy. In his experience, people often fought for what they believed was theirs. But this soldier hadn't. She had simply accepted what he had said and moved on. And that was what he couldn't quite figure out. What kind of person was she? She hadn't argued, hadn't fought for her seat, and yet there was something about her that made him feel like he had missed something important. As he glanced toward the back of the plane, where the soldier was sitting, he saw her again. She was still there, sitting quietly in her seat, looking out the window, her expression calm. He couldn't see her face clearly from where he sat, but there was something about the way she held herself that caught his attention. She didn't look angry or upset. She didn't look resentful. She simply looked peaceful. The man's curiosity grew stronger. He found himself stealing glances at her every so often, trying to make sense of what had happened. But each time he looked, she seemed no different. She was still composed, still at ease, while he was left with the feeling that something had shifted inside him. What was it about her that had made him feel so uneasy? What was it that had caused him to question his own actions? He had treated her like anyone else, like someone who wasn't entitled to the same respect he felt he deserved. But now, as he thought about it, he realized that his behavior had been wrong. He had made assumptions about her based on nothing more than her appearance. He had assumed that because she was in a military uniform, she didn't belong in first class. The more he thought about it, the more embarrassed he became. The soldier had given no indication that she was upset with him. In fact, she had acted with such grace and composure that it had made him feel like the one who had done something wrong. As the flight continued, the man began to reflect on his own life. He thought about his experiences, the privileges he had enjoyed, the things he had taken for granted. He realized that he had never truly understood what it meant to sacrifice, to give up comfort for a greater cause. He had never been in the soldier's shoes, had never known what it was like to serve in a way that required sacrifice and discipline. In that moment, he felt a shift inside himself. He wasn't just uncomfortable anymore. He was beginning to feel something deeper, something that made him want to make things right. But how could he? He had already made his mistake. It wasn't long before the man saw the soldier stand up again. This time, there was no hesitation in her movements. She got up from her seat in economy and walked toward the front of the plane, passing by the man's seat without even a glance in his direction. The man couldn't help but watch her as she moved down the aisle. There was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself, and once again, he felt that strange sense of unease wash over him. This time, he watched as she approached one of the flight attendants at the front of the plane. They spoke for a few moments, their conversation quiet and low, but the man couldn't hear what they were saying. He wondered what it was about. Was she going to ask for something? Or was she just taking a moment to chat with the attendant? The soldier turned away from the flight attendant and made her way back to her seat without any fanfare. She didn't seem to expect anything from anyone. She didn't look for recognition, didn't seek approval. It was as if she had already come to terms with her place in the world, whatever that might be. The man sat quietly in his seat, his mind racing. What had just happened? What had she said? He didn't know, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than he had first realized. There was something about the soldier, about the way she carried herself, that had left an impression on him. It wasn't just the way she had handled the situation earlier. It was something deeper, something that had made him think twice about the way he had treated her. As the flight continued, the man found himself more and more absorbed in his thoughts. The unease was still there, but it was now mixed with a sense of humility. He had been wrong, and he couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. The flight was nearing its final leg, and the man's mind was still restless. He had been trying to focus on the movie playing on the screen in front of him, but each scene seemed to blur together as his thoughts kept drifting back to the soldier. Her quiet strength, the way she had handled everything so calmly, he couldn't forget it. It was like her composure had pierced through his own layers of comfort, making him face something he had never truly thought about. He had been so wrapped up in his own world, in his own privileges, that he hadn't even considered what it might be like for others, for someone like her. He stole a glance toward the back of the plane again. She was sitting there, just like before, her eyes fixed on the window, seemingly lost in her own thoughts. She didn't appear upset or angry. She didn't even look frustrated. She just looked calm, at ease. It was a stark contrast to how he felt, restless, and full of questions he couldn't answer. The man glanced down at his lap, where his hands fidgeted nervously. He didn't know why he felt this sudden need to do something, to make it right. It wasn't like him to second-guess his actions, but the encounter with the soldier had forced him to do exactly that. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been wrong, that somehow the way he had treated her didn't sit right with him. He knew he needed to act, to fix it. But how? Just then, the plane hit a slight bump, and the man looked up in surprise. The small jolt broke his concentration, and he realized that the time to act might be slipping away. The soldier had stood up again, quietly this time, without drawing attention to herself. She walked down the aisle, her footsteps sure and steady, just like the first time. But this time, something was different. There was a look in her eyes, something determined but calm, that caught his attention. The man sat frozen for a moment, watching her approach the front of the plane again. He had no idea what she was doing, but this time, it felt different. She wasn't going to the flight attendants, nor was she simply walking for the sake of moving around. He had a feeling she was going to do something. Without thinking, the man stood up from his seat, suddenly filled with a mix of guilt and the need to fix his mistake. He didn't know why, but he felt the need to act now, to make things right before it was too late. As he stood, he felt his heart race a little. He wasn't sure how he would explain himself to her. What could he possibly say that would undo the cold dismissal he had shown her earlier? He walked down the aisle, passing rows of seats filled with quiet passengers, and as he approached the back, he saw her again. She was still walking, moving with that quiet, unshakable confidence. The man couldn't help but admire her posture. She carried herself like someone who had nothing to prove, someone who was simply at peace with who they were. When she reached the section where he had stood earlier, she stopped and glanced around. It was as though she had no need to check with anyone, no need for reassurance. She was simply there. But the man wasn't sure what to do next. He stood behind her for a moment, just taking in her calm presence. It was almost like she was waiting for him. Finally, after a few moments of hesitation, he cleared his throat, unsure of how to start the conversation. "Excuse me," he said, his voice sounding louder in the quiet of the cabin than he had intended. The soldier turned around, her face still calm. But now, there was a flicker of something in her eyes. It was a kind of curiosity, but it wasn't a look of anger or annoyance. It was something more neutral, something that made the man feel even more self-conscious. I just wanted to say that I'm sorry," he said, his voice suddenly faltering. He wasn't used to admitting he was wrong, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he owed her an apology. "I shouldn't have treated you the way I did earlier. I was out of line. I didn't understand, and I was wrong to assume." For a moment, the soldier said nothing. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. The man stood there, suddenly unsure if what he had said was enough. He had expected some sort of response, but she remained silent, making him feel vulnerable in a way he wasn't used to. But then, to his surprise, she nodded once. It wasn't a gesture of forgiveness, nor was it a sign of dismissal. It was simply a quiet acknowledgement, as if she understood exactly what he was trying to do. It was as if, in that brief moment, the weight of her experiences and her calm strength had given her the ability to understand the man's discomfort without the need for words. Without another word, the soldier turned and made her way back to her seat in economy. The man watched her for a moment, still standing in the aisle, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure if his apology had made any difference, but something about the way she had acknowledged him, something about her calm, quiet response, had shifted something inside him. As he slowly made his way back to his own seat, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had done something, however small, to make things right. He didn't know if the soldier would remember the encounter or if she would ever think about it again. But he knew that the brief interaction had changed him, had made him reconsider the way he viewed the world and the people in it. The flight continued, but for the man, everything felt different now. He didn't know where this feeling would lead him, but he knew that this small moment of humility would stick with him long after the plane had landed. The plane's hum filled the air, but the man's mind was racing. The encounter with the soldier had left him with more questions than answers. He had apologized, he had acknowledged his mistake, but what did that really mean? Did it change anything? The unease that had first settled in his chest had evolved into something deeper, a sense of responsibility, perhaps even a desire to make amends in ways he hadn't considered before. As the plane began its descent, he glanced out of the window once again, watching as the world below grew clearer. The landscape shifted from a soft blur of clouds to the recognizable outlines of cities and roads, and yet his thoughts were still consumed by the soldier. What had she thought of his apology? Had it been enough? Did she even care? He knew she hadn't said much. There was no grand speech, no moment of dramatic forgiveness. She hadn't asked for anything more, hadn't demanded any special treatment. She had simply acknowledged his apology with a quiet nod and gone back to her seat. But that wasn't the end of it for him. He couldn't shake the feeling that her silent response had said more than words ever could. The man felt a weight in his chest, a new understanding of something he had never truly considered. The world he lived in, his comfortable, privileged world, wasn't shared by everyone. He had always assumed that the rules applied equally to everyone, that the privileges he enjoyed were the same for others. But he had been wrong. And he realized now that he had dismissed the soldier not because of who she was, but because of what she represented to him. She had represented something he hadn't understood, something he had never needed to understand before. As the flight continued its descent, the man felt the impulse to stand and move around. He didn't want to sit anymore, not when his thoughts were running wild. He stood up, stretching his legs, and walked toward the back of the plane, making his way past the rows of seats toward the area where the soldier had been sitting. He wasn't sure why he was doing it. Maybe it was to prove something to himself, or perhaps it was to seek a deeper connection with the realization that had been growing in his mind. When he reached the back of the plane, he saw her again. She was sitting calmly, her eyes focused on the small screen in front of her, watching the in-flight movie as if the events of the day hadn't affected her at all. She looked peaceful, but there was an air of quiet strength about her that made him pause. He didn't want to disturb her, but something inside him urged him to speak. He cleared his throat and hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to say. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke. "I just wanted to thank you," he said, his voice soft but sincere, "for being patient with me. I was out of line earlier, and I've been thinking about it a lot." The soldier looked up at him then, her face neutral, but there was something in her eyes, a small flicker of something, perhaps acknowledgement. She nodded slightly, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and that was all. The man stood there for a moment, not quite knowing what to do next. Her reaction was not what he had expected. He had hoped for some sort of conversation, for a moment of connection that would allow him to make up for his previous behavior. But instead, she simply accepted his words and went back to her quiet, focused demeanor. It wasn't an easy thing to process. He had expected some sort of resolution, but there was none. And in a strange way, that lack of response made the encounter even more profound. There was no need for grand gestures, no need for more words. She had made it clear that the apology, the acknowledgement, was enough, and that realization hit him hard. As the plane began to land, the man felt an overwhelming sense of humility. He had expected a more dramatic resolution to the situation, but what he had received instead was far more powerful, the quiet dignity of the soldier. It was a dignity that came from strength, from experience, from knowing exactly who she was and what she stood for. She didn't need him to validate her. She didn't need anything from him. She simply existed in a way that demanded respect, whether or not he understood it in the moment. The plane touched down, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their arrival. Passengers began to gather their belongings, preparing to disembark. The man moved slowly, still lost in thought, as he grabbed his bag from the overhead compartment. As he moved toward the door, he glanced once more toward the back of the plane, where the soldier sat. She was already standing, ready to leave, her expression calm and composed. There was no fanfare, no rush. She simply moved with the flow of the others. For the first time in a long time, the man felt a deep sense of respect for someone. He didn't need to know her entire story to understand that she was a person who carried herself with integrity and strength. And somehow, that was enough. As he walked off the plane and into the terminal, the man carried with him a new sense of awareness. He had learned something that couldn't be taught through lectures or books. It was a lesson in humility, in understanding, and in respect. And it was a lesson he would carry with him long after the flight had ended. As the man made his way through the airport terminal, his steps were slower than usual. The bright lights of the concourse, the sounds of rolling luggage and distant chatter, all seemed distant to him now. He was lost in his thoughts, replaying the events of the flight over and over in his mind. The soldier's calmness, her quiet dignity, had left an indelible mark on him. The sense of unease that had settled in his chest during the flight had transformed into something deeper, a reflection on his own actions, his own assumptions, and the way he viewed the world. He passed through the security checkpoint without really noticing it, his mind too preoccupied to focus on the routine motions. It wasn't until he reached the baggage claim area that he finally stopped. He leaned against a pillar, looking at the crowd of people gathered around the conveyor belt. They were all waiting for their luggage, some chatting, others impatiently checking the time. But for the man, it all felt distant, like he was watching life unfold from a distance. The soldier had crossed his mind again, her quiet strength echoing in his thoughts. He realized now that his previous behavior had been driven by ignorance, a lack of understanding of the life she led, of the sacrifices she had made. He hadn't even thought about it before. He hadn't considered that maybe, just maybe, there were people who lived very different lives from his own. He had assumed that his experiences were the norm, that everyone saw the world the way he did. But now he saw things differently. He looked around at the people in the airport, and for the first time, he really saw them. He saw the young couple in the corner, holding hands and laughing softly. He saw the tired mother with her child, her face weary but loving. He noticed the elderly man who was slowly making his way to the baggage claim with the help of a cane. Each of them had a story, a life that was uniquely their own. And for the first time, the man understood that he couldn't make judgments about people based on superficial things. He had to look deeper, past the uniforms, past the appearances, past the surface level, to understand who they truly were. The conveyor belt started moving, and the man picked up his suitcase from the carousel, still lost in thought. He didn't even notice the weight of the bag in his hand. His mind was still on the soldier, still wondering what she was doing now, where she was going, and if she ever thought about their brief interaction. He didn't know if she would ever remember him, or if she would simply move on with her life. But he knew that he would remember her, that her quiet response had opened his eyes to something he had been blind to for far too long. As he made his way toward the exit, the man's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from a friend, something about catching up later. He smiled faintly but didn't respond immediately. His friend's message felt out of place, like something trivial in comparison to the thoughts racing through his head. Instead, he pocketed the phone and stepped outside into the warm air of the city. The evening sky was clear, and the soft glow of streetlights illuminated the streets. He took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. There was a peace in the stillness of the evening that matched the quiet transformation he was experiencing inside. He had learned something on that flight, something that wasn't easily understood or easily explained. It wasn't about the apology, nor was it about the soldier's response. It was about the shift in his perspective, the realization that the world was much bigger than his own narrow view. It was about understanding that everyone, regardless of their background, deserved respect and empathy. As the man walked toward the taxi stand, he thought about the changes this realization had sparked within him. The guilt he had felt earlier had begun to fade, replaced by a new sense of responsibility. He knew he had to do better, to treat others with the same respect that he now understood they deserved. But he also knew that this was just the beginning. Changing his mindset wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. He couldn't go back to the way things were. He had seen the world in a new light, and there was no turning back. When he finally got into the taxi and headed toward his home, he sat back in the seat, staring out the window at the passing city lights. The road ahead seemed uncertain, but there was a quiet hope that filled him. He had learned something important, something that would stay with him for a long time. He wasn't the same person who had boarded that flight, and he was determined to carry this new understanding with him, no matter where life took him next. The soldier's influence lingered, and the man realized that sometimes the most impactful moments were the ones that went unnoticed by others. A simple act of quiet strength could change someone's entire perspective, and he was grateful for that. The days following the flight seemed to pass in a blur, but the man couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him. It wasn't something he could easily put into words, but it was as though a new layer of understanding had settled over his perspective, one that made everything feel slightly different. He found himself looking at the world with a deeper sense of awareness, noticing things he hadn't paid attention to before. People, their stories, their struggles, all of it seemed more vivid, more real to him now. At work, the man found that his interactions with colleagues had shifted too. He no longer took for granted the privileges that came with his position, the comfort that surrounded him every day. It was subtle, but he began listening more intently when people spoke, really paying attention to their words, their emotions, and their experiences. He realized how much he had overlooked in the past, how often he had been caught up in his own world, blind to the lives of others. One afternoon, he found himself sitting at his desk, staring out the window, lost in thought. His mind kept drifting back to the soldier, her calmness, the way she had handled everything without a hint of bitterness or anger. He remembered how, even in the face of his rudeness, she hadn't fought back. She had simply moved forward, carrying herself with quiet dignity. It made him reflect on how he had treated others in the past, how quick he had been to judge or dismiss people based on surface-level things. He realized how wrong he had been, and how much more there was to every person than what he could see with his eyes. That night, as he sat down to dinner at home, he found himself lost in thought once again. The taste of the food was almost secondary to the realization that had been slowly unfolding within him. He had always thought of himself as a good person, someone who treated others decently. But now he saw that decency wasn't enough. True respect came from a deeper understanding, from recognizing the value and dignity in every person, no matter their background or circumstances. He thought about the soldier, wondering where she was now, what she was doing. He had no way of knowing, no way of finding out. But he also realized that he didn't need to know her story to understand her worth. He had learned what mattered in that brief encounter, her strength, her quiet resilience, and that was enough. The following week, the man had an opportunity to meet a colleague from another office, a woman who was new to the company. As they sat down for coffee, he couldn't help but notice the way she spoke. She seemed open and friendly, but there was an underlying layer of caution in her tone, as though she had been through something that had made her more guarded. It reminded him of the soldier in a way, the way she had moved through the world with a quiet confidence, as though she knew things that others didn't. As they spoke, the man found himself listening more closely than he usually did, picking up on the small details in her words. She told him about her background, about the challenges she had faced in her previous job, and the struggles she had overcome to get to where she was now. He could hear the strength in her voice, but there was also a vulnerability that she hadn't fully allowed herself to show. It was clear that she had worked hard to get where she was, and the man felt a deep respect for her, just as he had for the soldier. By the time the conversation ended, he realized that this was exactly what he had been missing in his own life, an awareness of the strength that others carried with them, even if they didn't always show it. It wasn't enough to just see people for who they appeared to be on the surface. True respect came from seeing the whole person, from understanding their journey and the challenges they had faced along the way. As he walked back to his office, the man felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had always thought that being kind and polite was enough, but now he knew that respect went deeper than that. It wasn't about how you treated someone in a moment of ease, when everything was going well. It was about how you treated them when things were hard, when they faced challenges you might never fully understand. He knew he could do better, be better, and it all started with truly seeing people for who they were, not just what they seemed to be. The soldier had given him a lesson that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. She had shown him that strength wasn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it was quiet and steady, like a river carving its way through the landscape. She had also shown him that respect wasn't something that could be given on a whim. It had to be earned by seeing others as equals, by understanding their humanity and the challenges they faced. As the days went on, the man began to change in ways he hadn't expected. He found himself reaching out to others more, offering help when he saw someone in need, and taking the time to listen to their stories. He realized that the world was full of people who had stories to tell, stories of strength, of struggle, of triumph. And by listening to those stories, he could learn, grow, and become a better person himself. The encounter with the soldier had been brief, but its impact had been profound. It had changed him in ways that words couldn't fully express. And now, he understood what it meant to truly respect someone, not just in their moments of strength, but in their moments of vulnerability too. It was a lesson that would stay with him forever, one that would shape the way he moved through the world from that day forward. The man woke up early the next morning, his mind still reflecting on the events of the past week. It was a Saturday, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't have to rush to work. He sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, feeling a quiet sense of gratitude for the simplicity of the moment. The day ahead seemed open and full of possibilities, but there was something in him that made him pause, as if the lessons he had learned in the past few days had shifted his focus. The soldier's image was still fresh in his mind, as though she had imprinted herself on his thoughts in a way he couldn't shake. He hadn't forgotten her calmness, the way she had carried herself with quiet dignity, and he realized that the way she had handled their brief interaction had affected him more deeply than he had expected. Her response had been simple, almost too simple, but that was what made it so powerful. She had shown him a kind of strength that wasn't loud or forceful, but steady, like a river flowing gently through a valley. And it wasn't just her actions that stayed with him, it was her presence. She had left an impression on him without saying much at all. As the man thought back on their encounter, he began to realize something even deeper. That brief moment had changed him in ways he couldn't fully describe, but it had inspired him to take a closer look at his own life. He had always been someone who prided himself on being polite, respectful even. But he had never truly understood what it meant to respect someone in a way that went beyond surface-level gestures. It wasn't about what people said or how they looked. It was about seeing them for who they truly were, understanding the strength they carried inside, the challenges they had faced, and recognizing that they, too, deserved the same respect and empathy he expected for himself. The man knew he had a long way to go. That change wouldn't happen overnight, but he was willing to put in the work. He couldn't simply go back to the way things had been. Something inside him had shifted, and it was a shift that he felt was necessary if he wanted to be a better person. His phone buzzed, breaking his train of thought. It was a message from an old friend, asking if he wanted to catch up over lunch. The man smiled and quickly typed a response, agreeing to meet later in the day. As he put the phone down, he realized how much he had taken his relationships for granted in the past. He had spent so much time focusing on his own ambitions, his own struggles, that he had overlooked the people around him. It wasn't just about respect for strangers anymore. It was about respect for the people who mattered most in his life, the ones who had always been there, who had supported him through the ups and downs. He realized now that he had a responsibility to show them the same understanding, the same empathy that he had learned to offer to the soldier and others. It wasn't enough to just be polite anymore. He needed to connect with people, to understand their stories, their struggles, and offer them the same respect he had come to understand. Later that afternoon, he met his friend at a local cafe. As they sat down, the conversation quickly turned to familiar topics: work, family, hobbies. But something was different this time. The man found himself listening more carefully than he had in the past, really paying attention to the little details in his friend's words. He noticed the way his friend spoke about his recent challenges at work, the frustrations he had been dealing with, and how he was coping with the changes in his personal life. It wasn't just about the surface-level things anymore. The man was listening to the deeper emotions behind the words. It felt good to be truly present in the conversation, to be there for his friend in a way he hadn't been before. As they talked, the man realized that these moments, these connections, were what truly mattered in life. It wasn't the material things, the achievements or the accolades. It was the people we shared our lives with, the ones who saw us at our best and our worst, the ones who truly understood us. After lunch, as he walked back home, the man felt a sense of fulfillment that he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't need grand gestures or dramatic moments to feel like he was making a difference. Sometimes it was the small acts of understanding, the quiet moments of connection that had the biggest impact. That evening, he found himself reflecting again on the soldier. He didn't know where she was or what she was doing now, but he hoped that wherever she was proud of the strength she carried with her every day. Her simple act of walking away without a word had taught him more than any book or lecture ever could. It had shown him that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is be yourself, to stay true to your values and walk with dignity, no matter what others may think or say. The man's thoughts shifted to his own life, to the changes he was making. He knew he had a lot of work to do, but he was ready to start. He wasn't going to take the people in his life for granted anymore. He wasn't going to judge others based on what he saw on the surface. He was going to listen more, understand more, and show respect in ways that went beyond the ordinary. As the night grew darker, he felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't about perfection. It was about progress, about making an effort to be better every day. He had learned something valuable, and he was determined to carry it forward. The soldier had shown him that strength comes in many forms, and true respect is about seeing the worth in others, no matter who they are or where they come from. And with that thought, he smiled softly to himself. It had been a small moment, one that could have been easily forgotten, but it had changed him. It was a change he knew would last, a change that would guide him as he moved forward in life.